Hi, this is Jeff Rodway from Novatec. I'm service manager here in Baltimore, Maryland. Today we're going to cover a little bit of basic troubleshooting and things to look for on an NWB dryer. First thing you have to look at is after you start it up with the screen, you'll notice several readings. You'll have the dew point reading, which generally is minus 40. You'll have your process temperature, which is settable by pressing the box with the number in it and then entering the actual number and pressing the enter button, and that number would change if you put in a different number. Then you have a reading that shows you the outlet temperature coming off of the hopper. Ideally, you want that outlet pressure or outlet temperature to be approximately 130 degrees. If you start getting too high on the outlet temperature of your hopper and getting back into the dryer, it's going to affect your dew point reading because the dew point reading is all high. So make sure if you're going to run over 140 on the return or 130 on the return, that you have the water cooler hooked up to the dryer. Another page is what we consider a pie chart screen. On the pie chart screen, you'll get a lot of information that tells you how the unit is actually working. You'll have the revolutions per hour. You usually want those somewhere around 10 on all the units with the exception of an NWB 25. On the NWB 25, that setting should be 6. You have the regeneration inlet temperature. That is usually set at the factory at somewhere around 380 degrees. If you have one of the features turned on, which is overdrive protection, that may automatically turn back or turn up depending on the outlet temperature. This is the outlet temperature for your Regen. Ideally, that outlet temperature needs to be above 212, the boiling point. You end up basically getting the desiccant hot enough that any moisture in the desiccant is vaporized and blown away from the desiccant. That way you can reuse the desiccant over and over.
Yeah.
On the other side, you'll have the dew point reading again at minus 40, which is the ideal reading on this unit. The process out, which is the process temperature that goes into the bottom of the drying hopper in a set. And again, the process return temperature. You want that process temperature to be 130, a max of 140, but preferably under 130. These are some of the other additional screens you can have on the unit. This gives you the main screen. It'll give you many options to go to different settings and operations. And you also have basically a charting system where you can read a chart that tells you how the operation of the unit has been over a period of time. Right now, I'll turn off the unit and we'll go back to the inside to look at the components to give you an idea of what goes where. When you turn the unit off, it does have an automatic cool down system of approximately 2 minutes. So at the end of that 2 minutes, you can go ahead and move it or change power sources, whatever you need to do. Inside the unit, you have PLC, the thermocouple module, and some additional I/O on the unit. The things you would have to look for is if a motor starter trip or a circuit breaker trip. They're all clearly labeled, and all you have to do is throw the switch on. This unit is what we consider a DC unit. The DC units have a built-in conveying system. These two motor starters are what control the motor for the conveying system. So they're a little bit different than most motor starters people are used to. These motor starters need to be put into a calibration mode in order to adjust the amperage. If for some reason you ever need to change this amperage, you can contact us at 410-789-4811, and we'll be glad to send you instructions on how to do that. The other things that you have are basically your relays, of course your disconnect, main circuit breaker, and your transforms. Corresponding to some of the components we looked at the control cabinet, this is one of your heaters. This is your process heater. There's a smaller heater, which looks very similar to the process heater. And on these heaters is a high-temp limit switch. Occasionally we'll get a high-temp limit error in message on the unit. When you get that, there's a small button on this heater that needs to be reset. You simply press that button, and all it does is take pressure. The button really doesn't move. When you put pressure on that switch, it will reset. Again, you'll be able to tell when you have that error by getting the error on the display on the front of the unit. The same goes for the Regen heater down below. It has the same style reset button on it. That simply put pressure on it and it'll reset by itself. On the desiccant rotor, there's a micro switch. The micro switch is what gives you the RPH of the unit. There's a small tab on the desiccant rotor that makes that micro switch once every revolution. So things to check if you get an error because your RPH count is too far out of pack. Come and check this switch. There's a wand on it that runs out and hits the cassette. As the cassette turns, that little knob will hit it and make it. That's, again, how you're making sure you're getting the right count. Make sure it is hitting. Make sure it is up against the knob as the rotor goes by, and that you do get the signal back to your PLC. There's a tension switch on a chain that drives the cassette itself. You want to make sure that there is tension on the chain itself, and that the chain is occasionally lubricated. What you want to do is use a silicone-type spray to lubricate that chain. Again, the chain needs to be lubricated. It will depend on your application on how often you have to lubricate the chain. You have two motors. Again, they go to the motor starters inside the control cabinet. The only time you'll have a problem with those or see a problem with them on the message screen is if those motor starters trip. Once they trip, if you can't get it running by resetting the motor starters, you may have to come in and check the leads and the resistance to make sure the motor is good. On the unit, there are some filters on both sides that are replaceable through the front of the unit. There'll be large doors with some knobs that you simply open the knob and pull the filter out. The filter should be checked periodically. As the unit is new, I would check these filters more often, and then as you know how often they become saturated with dust, that'll determine how quickly you end up changing or cleaning out the filters themselves. There's two pressure switches on the back side of the control cabinet. These are differential pressure switches that measure the pressure going across the filters. If the filters become blinded with dust, these switches will trip. So you have to make sure that your filter is in good condition. And if you do have a problem with a good filter, you may have to adjust that pressure switch. It is something that has to be done occasionally, but not very often. To adjust these pressure switches, it has a clear plastic cover on it. You undo the screw, the plastic cover will come off, and there's a screwdriver type adjustment dab smack in the middle of the switch. Simply turn it. It doesn't take very much to change the setting on it. There's a dial switch on the floor of the cassette mounting. You'll notice the switch, or the dial, is held in place with a small tab of silicone. This is adjusted at the factory. It should not have to be adjusted in the field. If you do have to adjust it, remove the small dab of silicone that's on there. As you adjust it, it's very, very sensitive. It takes a very, very small amount of adjustment to change the speed of the wheel. So you'll have to adjust it, let the unit run for maybe 10 to 15 minutes to get a good reading. Because as I stated earlier, you have to make that switch. It's only made once every 6 minutes. Of course, periodically check your hoses. Make sure there's no holes in them, no rips in them, no tears. One of the other things you have is the dew point sensor. That gave us the -40 dew point reading on the front of the display. We suggest that these sensors be replaced about once every 2 years. Again, application will affect how often it needs to be replaced. Overall, the unit you want to check is make sure that the hoses haven't collapsed, your thermocouples are in position, your temperature readings match what your settings are. As long as all that is correct, you should be ready to run.